Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my BookTube prize judging, octo-final judging video in which I break down which books I ranked from 6 to number 1 in the BookTube prize judging that I did. Wow, that's confusing, but anyway, here we go. So I was a judge for Nonfiction Group D, and like all the groups, that group included 6 books. I was really looking forward to the BookTube prize, A, because I did it last year, and I was looking forward to the fun of judging the BookTube prize again, and B, because I really liked the books that I got in my group. It was a really good mix of books, I thought. There were 2 chunky biographies, there were 2 memoirs, there was a book about science, and there was a true crime book. So kind of a really good mixed bag of books, and I was looking forward to reading them. I read 4 of them on my Kindle. Those were some of the first books I ever read on my e-reader, and I liked it. It was nice having kind of instant access to the books. I assume when I judge again, and I didn't volunteer to judge the next round, but I will volunteer to judge the round after that the Kindle will come in handy. I thought I would kind of outsmart the system and buy ebook copies of the books I was less sure I'd want to keep, and actual hardback copies, the books I thought I'd buy ebook copies of the books I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. I'd buy hardback print copies of the books I was pretty sure I'd want to keep, and that didn't necessarily work out for me. So in judging the books, I rated 2 of the books very good, 2 of the books good, 1 of the books meh, and 1 of the books actually bad. So here we go, ranking the books from number 6 to number 1. At number 6, I have Black Spartacus, The Life of Toussaint Louverture by Sudhir, Hajareesingh. This is the book I was looking most forward to. This is one of the books I voted for on the list that we should read, because the subject, Toussaint Louverture, who was the person who began the independence movement for Haiti and helped turn Haiti into the second oldest democracy in the Western Hemisphere after the United States, was a subject I wanted to learn more about. It was a subject I thought would be kind of really powerful and riveting and make for a great read. And unfortunately, I thought this book was bad. This has nothing to do with the subject matter. Louverture remains, to me, an intriguing and interesting historical figure, but I just thought Hajareesingh's book was bad, and I was really, really disappointed. It's kind of, I would classify it as hagiography, in the sense that the author is always on Louverture's side. He has a tendency to overlook Louverture's misdeeds, and historical figures from the 19th century are bound to have done things that by today's standards look awful, and even in the case of Louverture and lots of other 19th century historical figures that looked awful during the time period. But Hajareesingh really does not view those things objectively. He's always willing to make excuses for Louverture, and in some cases to just kind of gloss over the things that Louverture did, and in a position of trying to win Haiti's independence. Louverture was in a position where he had to make compromises, sometimes ethical compromises, which, didn't really work out very well. I thought the writing was bad. This book I literally had to drag myself to. The writing to me felt flat, stiff in some cases, overly wordy. I don't know, intentionally trying to create drama where there was none, trying to add import to things that didn't seem to be that important. And again, I'm not saying this about Louverture, the historical figure, but about the writing. And it was a real slog to get through this book. In addition to that, I thought that Hajareesingh's use of his sources as a historian was sometimes questionable and bad. He kind of criticized other biographers of Louverture, and then he actually used those biographies as sources. He included pictures of handbills and posters and newspapers related to Louverture, but those were all in French, even though the book was written in English without translation. There were just a lot of things about the book that I thought were bad, and I was really disappointed. I'm really interested to see if I'm an outlier on that book in particular. So at number 5, I have the true crime book, We Keep the Dead Close, A Murder at Harvard and a Half Century of Silence by Becky Cooper. So this is the story of a murdered Harvard grad student in the anthropology department that took place in an apartment complex that was owned by Harvard and was near campus, so in campus housing, and that murder was mysterious, and all kinds of weird things were associated with it, some true and some not. Some Harvard faculty were implicated, some Harvard students were implicated, and it seemed like the police were much more interested at the time, when the murder took place in the 1960s, in covering up the murder rather than actually finding the guilty party. Miss Cooper becomes obsessed with this murder, and obsessed is the right word for it. She is determined, 50 years after the fact, to track down every lead, every fact, every clue, to examine the possible motivations and actions of every possible suspect in the murder of this young woman. And it really took over her life. And, you know, in the book, she attempts to kind of, it appears as though investigating this murder is having some kind of cathartic impact on Miss Cooper's life, and that she's finding meaning in her own life by doing this. And, you know, things like that make me hesitate. But in addition to that, what happens is that Cooper kind of deals with things episodically, and all the chapters are really short, and there are a lot of people involved as potential witnesses, as friends, as potential suspects, as people who knew the suspects, as family members who knew somebody who might also, anyway. There are a lot of names, and it just became kind of a morass of information. And then in the end, and I won't spoil it, but in the end, or I will say the end was disappointing, given how much investment we as readers had made in trying to keep track of all this stuff, and how much effort Miss Cooper had made in writing about all this stuff. The writing, I thought, of the book was good. It was engaging. For the first 150 pages or so, I was on board. But as the book goes on, it failed to hold my interest, and it felt like Cooper was intentionally teasing out information and introducing things that were kind of red herrings that she could write about and distract the reader, rather than getting down to what actually happened. And I have to tell you, I think using the murder of someone, no matter how many decades ago it was, using the murder of someone to write a book in which you also talk about, you know, self-discovery and coming to understand who you were as a person, that just felt a little gross to me. So this was kind of my meh rating, and I ranked it at number 5. At number 4, I ranked The End of Everything, Astrophysically Speaking, by Katie Mack. Katie Mack is a physicist, and her specialty is in cosmology, which is the study of the cosmos and the universe and everything. I do enjoy reading physics books that are intended for, you know, lay readers, people like me who aren't experts, who don't have a real strong educational background in science or physics. And this book, I thought, was really good. And part of what made it good is that it was, unlike most of the physics books I've read, it wasn't focused on quantum physics and on the, you know, the subatomic physics, in which, you know, we appear to be somewhat at a dead end, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress. And instead, it focused on kind of big physics, universal things, you know, the Big Bang, what is dark matter and what's its effect, is the universe shrinking or expanding, how will the universe end? And it kind of did a great job of explaining how physicists in that field know what they know, how they understand, how they figured out there has to be dark matter, how they figured out, you know, whether or not the universe is expanding or contracting, etc. And I found that to be really, really interesting. Mack's writing is good. It's humorous. It's light. It's wry at times. I found her to be a great teacher and introducer and explainer of concepts, some of which I had not learned before, but I thought were explained really well here. If I were going to recommend a book about physics to people who are non-scientists, non-physics background, this one might be it, because it's entertaining and informative. And I will tell you honestly, I thought this book was going to be in my top 3 because I did enjoy reading it that much, and I enjoyed Ms. Mack's writing that much. But in the end, it was beat out by number 3. So at number 3, I have Memorial Drive by Natasha Trethewey, I believe is how you say her name. This is a memoir of the author's early life up into and just dealing with the aftermath of the murder of her mother by her stepfather. In a lot of ways, the story of Memorial Drive is depressingly familiar. But in other ways, the book itself and the writing is beautiful and powerful evocation of the importance of family and extended family and of place and of atmosphere and of a relationship between a mother and daughter. And I just found the story itself to be beautiful despite the tragedy involved in it. And it is a tragedy because one of the things the book really focuses on, I think, and the most powerful message of the book is how law enforcement often abandons women, particularly black women, who are involved in domestic violence situations and doesn't offer them enough protection and doesn't do enough for them because, in fact, Trethewey's mother was killed by her stepfather, who she had broken up with and was estranged from and had divorced. And the author's mother actually recorded her ex-husband, Trethewey's stepfather, threatening her. She had phone recordings which she turned into the police, and yet in the end, the man was able to get access to her and kill her, and then leaving the author, Natasha Trethewey, to kind of work through the trauma of that. And she talks about seeing herself in TV coverage because the murder was covered by local news in Atlanta, and seeing herself and it almost being like that's not her, that the situation wasn't real and that she wasn't able to deal with it at the time. And so it's a really powerful story, I think, about domestic violence, which should, along with all the other stories, should be waking us up to the reality and the tragedy involved in that, and pushing to do more against that, like Congress actually renewing the Violence Against Women Act would be a step in that direction. But it also kind of talks about family relationships and how important grandparents and aunts and uncles can be, and how difficult it can be for a child to go through a divorce from two parents that she loves very deeply, and how that dislocation upsets her life, and then physical relocation, and then being introduced to the man that becomes her stepfather, who is cruel to her and is abusive towards her, and how that leads to estrangement with her mother, was all just beautifully told. And I just thought it was a really powerful piece. Beautiful, tragic, all those things. And for that reason, it beat out Katie Mack's book about physics to be number 3 on my list. Number 2 on my list, the book I ranked number 2, is Recollections of My Nonexistence by Rebecca Solnit. Solnit is an author, an essayist, a feminist, an activist, an environmentalist. She's written about San Francisco and art and New Orleans and feminism, and her most famous book probably today is Men Explain Things to Me, from which the term mansplaining eventually was derived. And so she is an author who is fairly well known and who has a reputation. In this book, what Solnit does is she kind of deals episodically with events from her life and things that have influenced her into being the person that she feels or that she is today. Now, one of the main focuses of the book is misogyny and all the ways in which misogyny affects women and affected Rebecca Solnit in big ways, in small ways, in terrifying ways, in irritating microaggression ways. She does a good job, I think, of kind of dealing with that issue from occasions in which she had, even as a young teenager, who was followed home by creepy men who said inappropriate things to her, to just, something to in her professional life when she published her first 2 books, I believe, through City Lights Books, which is owned by the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and how Ferlinghetti would never even speak to her. He never talked to her. He never addressed her directly, even if they were in the same room. Things like that. Make this a book that I think that every man should read to kind of get an understanding of exactly how misogyny works, and all the ways, pernicious ways in which it makes its way into our society. The book also kind of highlights, though, Solnit's journey as a writer, how she got into writing, who her influences were, who the people who encouraged her were, what led her to the subject she chose to write about, things like walking and environmental activism. All those, she kind of details all those things, I think, in the book in really interesting ways. It is a memoir, but it is not attempting to offer a complete life picture of Solnit, more about kind of how she became the writer, maybe she is, the person she came to be. There's some beautiful stuff about writing about her living in San Francisco during the AIDS crisis, and how that decimated her friendship with a lot of gay men with whom she had found acceptance and openness and warmth, and I thought that was really powerfully rendered, and I really, really enjoyed the book. I have nothing bad to say about this book at all. Solnit's writing style, I think, is fairly unique. It is enjoyable. It is, in lots of ways, beautiful in itself, and I really came to enjoy the way that she writes. But I will say this, and this is the only remotely negative thing I can say, and it's not the book's fault. As someone who'd never read anything by Rebecca Solnit, and only had like a vague understanding of who she was, for this to be the first book by Solnit that I read about herself, I always felt like I was not quite getting the whole story, or there was something I was missing. There were things that she didn't maybe directly reference, which I felt like, well, I just felt a little disassociated from, because I think this book works best for people who have read Solnit, who are more aware of who she was, and this being my first Solnit book, that kind of detracted from the experience. But I very, very nearly made this my #1 pick. Because I did think the book worked and was great on so many levels, which just then leaves me with #1. So #1, maybe not surprisingly, given what the book is and its reputation, at #1 I put Red Comet, The Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Rebecca Clark. This is the big 933-page biography of Sylvia Plath, in which Clark attempts to rehabilitate how we see Plath, to kind of remove Plath from that pop culture figure, that icon, and to talk about her as an artist, to talk about her as a poet and a writer. And she does that over the 933 pages. Clark obviously had access to any resource and material you can imagine. I don't think anything was kept from her by any of the families that control access to information directly about her or about the people she knew. She conducted interviews with people who had known Plath during her life. This is an information-rich book, and it is an achievement. But I had some real problems with it, and those problems almost caused me to not rank it as #1. One of the things that I have to tell you that I found irritating about the book is the level of detail that is in the book. Details which I don't think are always relevant, or at least in the quantity of those details provided, I don't always think they're relative. We learn pretty much everything about Sylvia Plath. What she read, who her teachers were, who she dated, who her friends were, who she dated, what she wore, who she dated, what she had for dinner, who she dated, who her influences were, who she dated, how her doctors messed up, who she dated, her health problems, who she dated, harrowing details about her time in mental health facilities, who she dated, Ted Hughes, how that divorce went, who she dated, and then most importantly and best, how she wrote what she wrote, what her influences were, and how all these sources built up to create the extraordinary poetry that she created. At times the book is tedious in details, and I found some sections of it, particularly before she meets Ted Hughes, to be incredibly tedious. Now, I'm not saying that Ted Hughes is what makes the book interesting. That's not it. What makes the book interesting is what she wrote after she met Ted Hughes, and how, her writing changed, and how she was able to throw off all the conventions and all the stylistic formalism, which in lots of ways held her back from writing the poetry for which she is most famous and acknowledged to be her greatest poetry. So it's not Ted Hughes that makes it interesting insofar as it's just perhaps that relationship with Ted Hughes which contributed to her ability to break free from the things which were holding her back. In addition to that, I don't find Clark's writing to always be stellar. Sometimes it is repetitive. I didn't like the way she introduced information about what Plath was writing. She would tell you she wrote these stories or these poems in one chapter and that they were accepted for publication, and then when the poems or stories were accepted for publication, she would go back and talk about them again, and it just felt like she was always spoiling things. Rather than just saying she wrote this poem when she was a sophomore in college, she tells you she wrote that poem and that she submitted it and it was accepted, and this made her happy, and this had a good impact on her life. And then, because publication often usually takes place well after acceptance, then we get the discussion again after acceptance. And it felt like at times, because of that, as a reader, I felt like I was treading water, which is a bad thing in a book of this length, to feel like you're not making any progress. So, that might just be me, but I had kind of an issue with that. I had an issue near the end of the book of how she uses one source that I would say is highly questionable to make statements and an interpretation possible, and to introduce a possible alternate interpretation to the writing of the aerial poems, which I think diminishes everything Clark was trying to do. So I had some real issues. So you should be asking yourself by now, wow, that's a lot of negatives. How could you rank this book number one? And I ranked this book number one because it is an achievement. It is a remarkable achievement at pulling in all kinds of sources and explaining to us, good and bad, how Sylvia Plath came to be the writer that she was when she wrote the aerial poems. Clark doesn't spare Plath from the microscope. She examines the cruelty and the missteps and the way in which she hurt people. Clark examines and exposes all that, even if she does seem to be biased in favor of saying all that was necessary for Sylvia Plath to write the poetry she did. But that in and of itself is an achievement. But on top of that, Clark's discussion of Plath's writing, of the poems that make up the collection, Colossus and Ariel, is just extraordinary. Her discussion of where those poems came from, of the symbolism, the images, the influence of those poems is just remarkable. And that writing, quite literally sings. And you can fly through those sections and be kind of awestruck, not just by Plath's craft and talent and intelligence and genius, but by Clark's ability to convey that information to you. And so, quite simply, even though I had lots of problems with the book, and there are lots of things I didn't think that Clark did particularly well, the parts she did well were better than anything else I read. Easily, the parts where Clark was at her best, and those are the parts where she's describing Plath at work and how she created these poems, achieved what she wanted. She shows Plath as a genius, as an artist, as a craftsman, as somebody who worked hard and was dedicated to their craft, who wrote every day possible. And considering all the things that you will learn which were obstacles to that is remarkable. And that makes this book remarkable despite its flaws. So despite the flaws I pointed out, I ranked this book as #1. And for those of you who were hoping that Red Comet would be eliminated so you wouldn't have to read it in the upcoming rounds, I'm sorry, I can't be one of the people who does that. I, again, wait to see what others think. Anyway, there you go. There's my wrap-up of the BookTube prize judging that I did for Nonfiction Group D in the octafinal round. I really look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And I particularly look forward to getting to watch the results, which hopefully my video will be posted shortly after the results video goes up. And then you can see what everybody else, where everybody else ranked the books, particularly those people who judge the same group as I. Anyway, there you go. Thanks for watching.